live here now at the second day of Intermodal for a new podcast, and now we're going to be talking a little bit more about Airfreight and sustainability, right? I had two of my greatest friends for live here talking about sustainability. We're very sustainable in our relationships, aren't we? Yeah. I have Glyn Hughes. He's today the Director General for TIACA.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, and I have Lorena Jorge. Lorena Jorge is the wizard who handles all the global procurement for craft worldwide, and she sits in Uruguay and is here with us today. So we're very proud to have this brilliant mind.
Reference in compared to those three areas, but it shouldn't be about an end game. You know, sustainability is really about a journey. It's about a journey for a better tomorrow across all the various aspects of both business and social.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, almost brought tears to my eyes, isn't it? That's it is larger than just one thing, right? Than just the carbon footprint or anything like that, right?
So, which are important parts. We shouldn't undermine the importance of the environmental aspect, and I know we'll talk a lot about how we're, as an industry, working to improve the environmental footprint. But we should also not lose sight of the social impact that this industry, and in fact the logistics industry, brings to the global economy.
Enabling smaller markets to grow, right? Making them capitalize higher, grow in every single sense of the word, grow.
And in what ways do you guys see, from your perspective, that Airfreight can actually be the most sustainable option in the supply chain?
Right. Well,
contrary to what people believe.
Yeah,
right?
and I think a lot of people have views based on lack of information. So I think as an industry, first and foremost, we have to bring to the discussion what Lorena just talked about. I'll give you a statistic, for example. Since the early 1990s, the World Bank has performed a study that says over 1 billion people have been raised out of extreme poverty because of the expansion of the global economy. So when you look at the global economy and you say, well, what role does air cargo play in that? Well, we move about 35% of the global trade by value. So we're enabling those small communities, which Lorena helped so wonderfully, to bring their products to market around the world. And we do that in a responsible fashion, making sure that, as we said before, the environmental footprint is kept to the most minimal impact possible.
Yeah.
Reducing overstock, right? Time efficiency, being more assertive in the not having overproduction. Right?
And if I may, because I think that's a key part there, is that the role of air cargo, and when you talk about how can we as an industry play a much bigger part, it's exactly what Lorena was just saying there, which is if you look at traditional production techniques that have occurred over the last 2-3 decades, it was about mass production to get the lowest unit cost of production and moving mass items. Sadly, a consequence of production-based consumption is you have wastage. If you move to a much more sustainable production model, you actually do micro-production, which is produce the items that are needed by the consumer when they're needed and in the quantity runs which make it economically viable to produce, but then you can actually tap into a much more effective supply chain model, which means air cargo, which is first and foremost, we know unique value proposition is speed. So it supports micro production. A lot of fashion houses now have moved away from mass production into, as I say, micro production runs, because wastage is really where that's the significant impact on society. If you take the fashion industry, about 84% of the global emissions of a garment is in the production cycle, not the transportation and not the supply chain. So by reducing the production, reducing the wastage, you're actually having a much more positive impact than actually moving your supply chain to a different mode of transport.
And we're seeing that tendency today, right? So we're seeing the tendency globally, the kilos, the weight per shipment in the air freight is actually reducing. So meaning people are buying in more frequency, being more assertive, not having overstock, which actually helps the airline industry optimize their flights even better, right? So the space optimization is much better today than if you have one single huge shipment to move. And
do you have an example? I mean, you don't need to mention the brands. You were saying fashion houses and clothing is something that really, when we're talking about regeneration of the planet, clothing, we always think of those piles of clothing everywhere and what's happening and how it's destroying the environment. How do you see air freight helping, that industry, for instance?
Well, we have some retailers that you clearly perceive the way they rearrange the cycles of their of the fashion. So you got in one part of the world, instead of having the waste there and burning it, they're going to move that part, the excess of clothing, into the next season in the other part of the world. That's being all 100% being moved by air. So, and you have other fashion clothing and brands that they burn their waste because they really don't, right? They're protecting the brand.
And in fact, you two are far too young to know this, but originally for me, fast fashion when I was growing up was walking along the high street at a fast pace. That was what we called fast fashion. But if you look back then, most fashion houses, it was production runs that were 4 times a year. It was 4 seasons. And they did that because their consumers would come in 4 times a year. They would buy their winter, their summer, their spring, and their autumn clothes. Then when the Inditex chain came in with Zara, Massimo Dutti, they absolutely completely restructured how fashion was moved, and we called it fast fashion because it was predominantly supplying through air cargo globally, but it was supplying retail outlets, but they did so on a much more frequent basis because their consumers came in 39 times a year. So they came in at a much higher frequency, so they needed to have a much higher turnover of product. So they reduced production, made it much more dynamic to what the consumers wanted, and again used air. Now we actually look at 2025 onwards, we've got people like Shein, which have rewritten that model with ultra fast fashion, which is no retail outlets. It's a consumer base that changes 365 days a year. They're online looking for something different. So they've really modeled now the one I mentioned before, which was the micro production run. So they actually produce garments in runs of 100 items because their objective is to have zero waste, not low waste, zero waste. They said because zero waste is the only way they can actually value the raw materials that have gone into their products. And as Laura was saying, they know they can get maximum efficiency from their supply chains. So it's fascinating how air cargo has been there to support these consumer evolutions and production evolutions.
Yeah. And then you can also use that for recycling and upcycling those materials, not just throwing them into piles of old clothing.
That, to be honest, is a great part as well, where we have to work much more closely with the maritime sector, because we do need to look at the global impact. So we need to look at recycling, upcycling, reusing materials, reintroducing them at a different point of the production to save, again, going back to Mother Earth and effectively retaking from the soil. We need to what takes already been used. We need to recycle clothing to get back to the raw fibers. And again, it's through using maritime sector, which is a much cheaper, slower mode of transport, but it's got an ideal place to move those bulk items. And then air cargo can be there for the value-added items, final consumption.
Yeah, or to make it faster, like you were mentioning, those big fast fashion chains. No, it's fast fashion, ultra mega blaster fashion, whatever. But you mentioned that this is what allows that summer in one place is winter in the other place, so they move cargo around, and that's when air freight comes in because it needs to be fast.
Absolutely.
So what is not selling in a store in I don't know, in Thailand could be sold the other day somewhere else in another country.
But that's where they want to use analytics and effectively to actually monitor that. So rather than ultimately have product in the place that's not selling, don't get it there in the first place. Let's actually try and understand consumer behavior. Predictive consumption, I think, is where AI is going to have a huge role. For example, you look at me and predictive consumption, I don't need to buy shampoo. Okay, never. I haven't bought shampoo for years. I don't own a hairbrush. You two do. So very quickly, people could pattern and identify what cycle do you replace your hairbrushes, do you shampoo, clothing, etc. I wear out a pair of shoes with so many conferences pretty much once every 12 months. So once that consumer activity is known, you can actually then tailor production around individual consumer behavior.
Yeah, it's endless, right? It's really the principle of circular economy. That is brilliant. Yeah, that is brilliant. Yeah, it's very active around here, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. This is as active as the air freight industry, right? Yeah. So, how can you see? We talk a lot about how we can connect. Lore, we talk a lot about the local heroes, right? How can we can air freight be the moving engine around connecting local economies to global, to a global network?
If we look at it from our perspective as MVOs, we are enablers of not only space and rates, but also intelligence on how to be optimizing routes, logistics in every single aspect for any type of customer, any type of business. So if we look at it in that sentence, we're taking the local heroes that are not huge, right? And enabling their way through the global market, assisting the growth, and of course, what I said before, optimizing their logistics in every single aspect, connecting, like Glyn said, ocean and air. Maybe it's not the ocean and air model perfect, but we make it happen, we create it.
And the super large industries, they have access to that, but the smaller guys, how would they have access to different kinds of solutions, right?
Yeah. And if I may, I think you started off the discussion by saying about the notion of bad guys. And one area where we as an association quite often find ourselves in a public debate is with retail chains, supermarkets, for example. Every so often they'll say they're bowing to local consumer demands, and they actually have a buy local, grow local, sell local, consume local campaigns. We've had a lot of discussions with a lot of, particularly in Western Europe, retail chains, grocery chains, where they, for example, were rejecting flowers that were coming in from East Africa. And we said, look, if you look at Valentine's Day, which every year, if I'm not mistaken, falls in February from what I can remember. It's not really, I don't get flowers anymore, but I do remember.
In Brazil, it's in June. It's the only country where they changed it.
I just learned that.
Didn't know that. Okay, but for the other 192 countries and 28 territories around the world, Valentine's Day in February. If you wanted to have flowers grown in Europe to deliver and to hand over in February, you'd have to grow them in artificially heated greenhouses. You'd have to use chemical pesticides, fertilizers, which help to ruin, or they lead to ruination of the water table and the local ecosystems. Not to mention the fact that today the flowers predominantly coming from two countries, which is Kenya and Ethiopia in Eastern Europe. And of course here we've got Ecuador and we've got Colombia. There is at least 18 million families, small farm holders in East Africa who are able to put food on their table for their families, send their children to school because they're growing flowers in natural conditions. So air cargo there is actually not only enabling trade, it's enabling prosperity, it's actually supporting friends, family and loved ones having a nice experience. And this is the story we have to get out there. So when we've actually combated against some of these grocery chains, they've actually moved away from, they called it fair miles or whatever they have programs, because they realize that the social impact and the environmental responsibility that all supply chains, but mostly air cargo, is focusing on, is actually worthwhile supporting global communities.
Not just the carbon footprint.
It's not just the carbon footprint as well, it's about the social footprint, and it's the impact that we actually can support globally. And as I say, we owe it to global communities, which is why it's so important to keep the global economy and open and fair and free trade flowing. The minute you start putting protectionist measures in place, it actually destroys, as Lore was saying, the ability to optimize, which actually makes the environmental impact even worse, because you're now moving less over an infrastructure and a network that's designed to carry more. So it's important to keep things open and fair for so many reasons.
This is brilliant. And then, and you're also causing less of an impact in nature itself, right? And you're using this is all such a virtuous circle that we can create, right? And then we generate all. And of course, with the air freight, there's the natural velocity that we always talk about, but how can this speed of doing the trade itself can actually impact on so many different ways, not only the flowers, but you quote so many different examples that we can do, right?
Well, I'm going to do another one, if I may.
No, yeah, please.
Yeah. Everybody knew during COVID, when 65% of global aviation was grounded, borders were closed, the world needed PPE initially. Air cargo moved that PPE around. Then when the world needed vaccines, air cargo moved those vaccines around. What people don't realize is that every single day of the year, the great work that you guys do and your other colleagues out there in the logistics world are doing are saving lives every day. In Latin America, 20 million children's lives are protected every year because of vaccination programs that Pan American Health Organization construct. The vaccines that they use come from India and China. They're volatile. They cannot move on maritime. They can't move on ocean. They can only move on air. They can only move on air, and they can tend to mostly move in the bellies of passenger aircraft because they need to move everywhere. And those people who says, well, we don't want air cargo, we don't need to move it, who's going to tell the families of those 20 million children, I'm sorry, your children's life is not important enough to move that vaccine? At least another 20 million are protected in Africa every year. For diseases that we in the developed world take for granted as being eradicated, people are living with the fear of these diseases every single day. Vaccination programs can only happen because of the commercial networks that you guys are using to move product around the world. Those are creating the networks which the humanitarian sector can then leverage for the good of humanity.
That's brilliant. Yeah. And what I look at it, well, we were talking about this. Laura has mentioned a few times the overproduction that, and you mentioned that as well. What other hidden environmental gains that we're not seeing that is actually being tackled and being?
Well, that's a great question as well, because even though planes look the same as they've done for the last 20 or 30 years, they're about 45% more fuel efficient. They're even using different materials in the paint, which actually lower the coefficient of drag, which reduces fuel burn. You look at the wingtips, again reduces fuel burn. On the ground, you've got cargo facilities that are using quite a lot now of roof space for solar panels, recycling water coming through, electrification, smart facilities, even single engine taxiing, electric bot taxiing, hydrogen-based ground vehicles, I mean, there are so many great initiatives that are underway in the logistics space because we do take the impact on the planet, our responsibility very seriously. So there's a lot of investment, but there's more to be done. As we said, it's a journey. Is the industry finished? Absolutely not. We know we've got a long way to go, but we want to do so still enabling goods to go from point of production to point of consumption to help somebody make a livelihood.
And also understand that the industry is going to be there whether we like it or not, right? We talk about, okay, so there are large industries who are saying, let's move everything to ocean. And then you think, well, the planes are flying anyway, they're flying with people anyway, and most of the capacity is in the bellies of the airplanes. So they're going, we need to be using that space in our behalf to be generating that
great.
virtual circle.
And I quite often, I'm an air cargo guy. I've been an air cargo guy since the Wright brothers made that first flight. I was there. I was pushing the plane in Kitty Hawk. You're not correcting me. You should say, Glyn, you're far too young, but okay, I'll take that. We know you were there, Glyn.
No, actually, I was going to correct you about the Wright brothers. It's actually a Brazilian. There is a thing about Santos Dumont, but let's not go there because we're friends.
But basically, though, what I'm saying is that we as the air cargo sector need to work much more closely with the maritime sector because, as you mentioned earlier, we only move 1% of global trade by volume, roughly. So we need to make sure that the two sectors work hand in hand. We need to make improvements environmentally. The maritime sector needs to make improvements. So as everybody can improve the environmental impact, we can also help enhance the social impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How can you, if these discussions were happening with both industries together, right, it could be a much more productive environment, yes. Right? Yeah. And I'm really glad that you, as the TIACA representative, is the voice of industry, because the way you put it, I mean, let's get some ocean guys over here to talk to us, right? Yeah.
So we have some ideas to float by the ocean guys.
Yeah. We do. Let's fly it with them. And you were talking about predictive AI and technology, and how the fact that we're going digital, and how do you, can you give me some more examples of how we can actually put technology to work towards our industries in that sense?
I think the key thing about technology is we shouldn't be restricted by the boundaries that we insert as humans. You know, I think you guys have a great display here with a robot, and when you link that with generative AI and other aspects, it pushes new boundaries. So I think, first of all, you know, the digital environment will start capturing information as a consumer, which will help then feed into the production. The production runs can then feed into their logistical supply chain partners about helping. Laura's, one of the big challenges is optimization and utilization. So the more information you can get from producers. We had a problem in Latin America last year, I think, with the cherry season, that they had 50% more production than they were planning for. There wasn't the capacity for it. So a lot of the cherries, you know, didn't fly by air. They went in a different mode, and they ended up as cherry juice rather than fresh cherries, which has a different product value to it. Yeah. So I think we need to use technology, and then the technology can come for disruption management. If things are moving through the supply chain, a very complex ecosystem that we've got, but when there's problems that can be identified, you can then use the technology to actually come up with disruption management techniques and communicating with all of the supply chain, communicating with customs, make everything more efficient, lower the costs, make it more accessible. Everybody wins.
And with that, I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking also about hyper-personalization and how we can meet up to the end. I mean, we track the whole chain, and we let people know, you know, that the flowers that they're buying is actually coming from those people there. And there are industries that actually do that, but the more we can do that, we put technology to our favor to actually bring the human connection to it. This is what you're doing by actually doing this, and this bridges the gap between people, between industries, between, you know, that could be very interesting. Yeah. So, and now this is my final question. Unfortunately, I think I could be talking to you guys, and we do. When we sit together, we could talk for 2 days, right, in a row. But when you think about all these players in the ecosystem of movements overall, like moving freight, I mean moving lives around, right? So the freight forwarders, the brokers, the shippers, the governments. What do you think we could be doing to be doing smarter, working smarter together?
Yeah, can I start with this? Because there's something, you know, I said I've been in this industry a long time. When I joined this industry, we moved boxes from A to B. That was the job. Things have evolved. We don't move boxes anymore, we move emotions. It's the impact of what's inside that box. And that's the message that we need to get out. Whether or not, and we've talked about the flowers, it could be flowers, it could be jewelry, it could be a smartphone, it could be an item of clothing, it could be a wedding dress, it could be an organ, it could be a vaccine, as we said, it could be cancer, life-saving treatment. Whatever it is, we need to focus on the impact that it brings. And that's how we actually need to get that story out to the next generation, to attract and entice them into this industry, as well as the regulators, to help them come up with enabling regulatory environments to support what we do, and as well as those people out there who don't understand our industry because they take a negative stance and I don't blame them, because they just look at the outside in. We want them to look at the inside out. So if we can communicate the impact that we bring, I think it will actually help everybody come together.
Yeah, brilliant. So my next question was going to be, okay, what would be your advice to the younger generations to actually look into air freight as a great industry to be in, and how this could be connecting with their own purpose in life? You kind of answered that, but give me it in one sentence. What would you tell?
I actually tell them to picture their life without air cargo. Because that means they don't have a smartphone, they don't have a game station at home, they don't have electricity, they don't have cars outside, they probably don't have clothes, they may not have food on their table. You know, life would be completely different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they actually would make lives happen, continue to happen. Yeah, that's brilliant. What about you, Lore? What would you tell the younger generations?
Well,
Laura is the younger generation, so that's...
Yeah. Thank you.
What would you tell yourself looking in the mirror?
Sustainability is in all of us, so it actually it's what we can do better in the industry that we're at to make that make sense, making the message across, making sure that we work smarter, not harder. And in this industry, it's absolutely